Smoke drifted across the ruins of New Salem, carrying with it the stench of charred metal and flesh. The colony had been alive just days ago, full of laughter and light, its streets dotted with children running between prefab houses. Now silence stretched across the settlement, broken only by the muted voices of Marines combing through rubble. Corpsmen moved carefully, laying bodies beneath white sheets. Too many were small, their shapes unmistakable beneath the cloth. Soldiers who had faced enemy fire without flinching now stood with lowered heads, hands tied on their rifles, their jaws clenched. Colonel Marcus Kane stepped from the landing craft, boots sinking into blackened soil. The tall Marine officer paused, his face unreadable as he scanned the devastation. His men didn't approach him, they knew better. He walked slowly, deliberate, toward the line of bodies being arranged at the edge of the blast crater. One sheet caught the wind, peeling back enough to reveal a young girl's face, ash streaked across her skin. Kane knelt and pressed the cloth back down. His gloved hand lingered for a moment, trembling before it steadied again. He closed his eyes. His daughter would have been her age, if she had lived. The memory cut like shrapnel. "Sir," a sergeant said quietly, breaking the silence. "Orders from the Union are to hold position and await diplomatic channels." Kane rose, eyes still on the graves. His voice came cold and precise. "Diplomats don't bury our dead." The sergeant swallowed hard and nodded. No more needed to be said. Behind them, the chaplain murmured over the coffins being lowered into the ground. Marines stood in silence, rifles held vertical in salute. The ceremony was simple, unadorned, but the weight of it pressed heavier than any battlefield. Kane did not join the circle. He watched from a distance, shoulders rigid, his gaze fixed on the children's row. Hours later, in the dim light of the command tent, Kane studied a holomap projecting the system. Red markers flashed, slaver patrol routes, intercepted transmissions, fragments of intelligence. His officers waited tense for instructions. "The council debates sanctions," one major said bitterly. "They're afraid of destabilizing trade." Another officer slammed his fist against the table. "Children, sir! They butchered children!" Kane's eyes remained on the map, but his tone cut through the noise. "This is not a council decision. Washington has given us clearance. No limits." The room fell silent. Every officer there knew what that meant. The United States had chosen vengeance while the rest of the Galactic Union wrung its hands. Kane's unit would not wait for permission. He lifted his gaze finally, meeting each set of eyes in turn. "We will not answer slaughter with petitions. We will answer with graves. Their leaders, their ships, their outposts, every one of them will learn what happens when they touch our children." The major hesitated, then asked quietly, "And if the Union pushes back?" Kane's expression hardened. "Let them. America didn't build this corps to beg for consensus." When the meeting broke, whispers carried across the camp. Soldiers repeated his words like scripture, and for the first time since landing on New Salem, a fierce clarity steadied their grief. Later, Kane walked the burial grounds alone. Fresh earth stretched in rows, lit by floodlights. Marines had marked the children's section apart. He stood there, motionless, for a long time. Finally, his voice dropped to a whisper only the graves could hear. "You won't be forgotten. You'll be avenged." The next morning, he summoned his hand-picked strike team, veterans from a dozen battlefields. They gathered in the armory, helmets tucked under their arms, waiting for orders. Kane entered with a presence that stilled the room. He carried no notes, no speech prepared. He didn't need one. "They killed our children," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "So we will bury their empire." No cheers, no noise followed. Only grim nods, the kind of assent that bound men and women tighter than blood. One Marine, younger than the rest, muttered the name in a hushed tone. "Gravekeeper." It spread quietly through the unit, not shouted but spoken with the reverence of a curse. Kane didn't acknowledge it. He only turned toward the starfield beyond the hangar doors, his jaw set. The war would not begin with declarations or parades. It would begin with his team slipping across the frontier, striking at shadows until the Dominion's masters realized their hunters had arrived. As the Marines prepped their gear, Kane remained apart, staring out at the void. Somewhere out there, Veilthar and his slavers celebrated their raid, counting profits in blood. They believed humanity would do what the rest of the galaxy always did, send words, not warships. Kane whispered, so quietly none could hear. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet. The fleet engines lit the night sky, rising from the scarred colony like a funeral pyre. New Salem's graves faded beneath the clouds as the ships ascended, carrying with them a promise. The Gravekeeper had begun his hunt. The first strike came without warning. A slaver transport, fat with stolen cargo and shackled prisoners, drifted along its route toward the Dominion's nearest market. Its crew laughed in guttural voices, drinking to their success. Then the alarms screamed. Breaching pods tore through the hull, their magnetic clamps locking tight. Explosive bolts blew, and Marines in black armor poured inside. The slavers raised weapons, but the humans moved with precision, burst fire, sharp blades, every shot deliberate. In less than 3 minutes, the ship's bridge was taken, the captain bleeding across the command console. Colonel Marcus Kane stood among the carnage, rifle at his shoulder, his eyes unblinking. He spoke only once. Free the prisoners! Burn the rest! When the rescued stumbled out, alien families, gaunt and bruised, they were met not with pity but with efficient guidance. Marines cut their chains, handed out rations, and herded them toward evacuation shuttles. Behind them, demolition charges thumped into bulkheads. The transport went up in a bloom of fire, nothing left for the slaver empire to reclaim. Word spread quickly. By the third raid, survivors carried stories across star lanes. A human commander who never spoke more than a handful of words, whose soldiers killed like reapers in the dark. Some said he collected bones. Others swore he whispered prayers to the children his enemies had slaughtered. They called him the Gravekeeper. Days later, Kane's unit hit a slaver outpost carved into a hollowed asteroid. The corridors reeked of blood and oil, cages stacked like market stalls. When the Marines breached, panic broke instantly. Slavers tried to rally, but the fight was already over. A young Marine kicked open a cell and froze. Inside were 3 alien children, wide-eyed, their faces streaked with dirt. One clung to his wrist as he tried to lead them out. He glanced helplessly toward Kane. The colonel knelt, removing his helmet. His scarred face was hard, but his voice softened. You're safe now. Nobody will hurt you again. The children didn't understand his words, but they understood tone. They pressed close, trusting him. The Marine's eyes shone as he whispered, Sir, why do we always go this far? They're not even ours. Kane's expression didn't change. Because if you can't protect children, you don't deserve the stars. The words settled like stone. Even the veteran Marines, men and women who had long ago hardened themselves to loss, felt the weight of it. None questioned him again. Back in Dominion space, Overlord Veilthar lounged on his throne of black iron, chains rattling across the floor where slaves were forced to kneel as living decor. He listened to reports with a sneer. 3 outposts gone. 4 transports destroyed, one officer stammered. Veilthar chuckled. Humans lash out like animals when hurt. They'll burn themselves out. Let them howl. But another commander shifted uneasily. My lord, mercenaries refuse contracts against them. They say humans are cursed. That a demon hunts in their ranks. Veilthar's smile faltered, though only for an instant. Then double their pay. There are no demons, only flesh that bleeds. These humans will learn what it means to face the Dominion. Still, unease lingered in the chamber. Even the most brutal slavers knew the power of reputation, and fear spread faster than any fleet. On the USS Resolute, Kane studied intercepted transmissions. A captured officer had cracked under interrogation, spilling fragments of useful intelligence. The Karth Dominion's overlord was aboard his fortress ship on the Galactic rim, surrounded by loyal guards and walls of steel. A sergeant leaned against the console, watching Kane. Sir, we've bled them dry in 6 sectors. But hitting the Chain Lord himself? That's a fortress. Kane's gaze didn't shift. Then we crack it. The sergeant exhaled slowly. You really mean to kill him, don't you? Kane finally looked up, his stare sharp as glass. I don't mean to. I will. Their next raid nearly ended in disaster. The Marines infiltrated a slaver convoy, but this time the enemy was prepared. Turrets unfolded, mercenaries hired from 5 different species opened fire, and the corridors turned into kill zones. Kane moved like a ghost, pushing his soldiers forward. When one man fell screaming, Kane dragged him to cover, applied a pressure pack, and ordered him back to the dropship. Then he turned back into the storm, firing bursts that cut through mercenaries like scythes through grass. When the last defender fell, the remaining slavers dropped their weapons, begging for mercy. Kane stared at them in silence. One officer trembled. Why do you not stop? You fight like monsters. Kane's voice was low, each word carrying finality. You killed our children. Monsters don't stop until the grave is full. He raised his rifle. None of the slavers lived to see another sunrise. In the aftermath, the Marines sifted through data cores. Among the encrypted files was confirmation: Vaelthar's fortress ship, the Chainhold, was anchored in the Erythros system. Hardened, shielded, and thought impregnable. Kane's officers gathered around him, the hollow display glowing red across their armor. Sir, the intelligence officer said, this is suicide. Whole fleets have broken against that stronghold. Kane's eyes didn't waver. That fortress is where the Chainlord sits. End him, end the raids. One Marine muttered under his breath. Gravekeeper doesn't fight wars. He ends them. The others nodded. It was no longer just a mission, it was a crusade. In the mess hall that night, soldiers sat together in silence, helmets on the table, food untouched. The air carried an almost sacred tension. Finally, one Marine asked, Do you think we'll make it out? Another shrugged. Doesn't matter. The colonel will. Kane passed among them, hearing the whispers but not acknowledging them. He didn't need to. His men didn't follow him because they believed survival was certain. They followed because vengeance was. When he entered the strategy room, the war fleet captains rose. Kane spoke only one line. The Chain Lord thinks he's safe. Tomorrow, he learns there's no fortress deep enough. Engines rumbled as the fleet prepared to burn toward the galactic rim. Outside the viewports, stars shifted, waiting. Somewhere out there, the slaver empire still laughed over the graves of New Salem's children. That laughter would end soon. The hunt was closing in. The American fleet dropped out of FTL with a flare of light, guns already hot. The stars above the Erythros system blazed against the dark bulk of the Chainhold, a fortress ship the size of a city, armored in black plating and bristling with turrets. Entire fleets had died against it. Marcus Kane stood on the command deck of the USS Resolute, helmet under his arm, eyes locked on the beast ahead. The fortress loomed like a tombstone carved for a galaxy too blind to see its fate. Status? He asked. Shields rising across the station. The tactical officer replied. Fighter wings launching. Their guns are powering. Kane's jaw set. All batteries fire. The void lit up. Rail slugs and plasma lances slammed into the fortress's shields, carving sparks across the black shell. Enemy fire answered, hammering the fleet, but the Americans pressed forward, grim and relentless. Dropships streaked toward the fortress, weaving through the chaos. Kane's strike team rode in silence, weapons clutched to their chests. The hull rattled as flak tore through space around them. A young Marine broke the silence. Sir, what if the intel's wrong? Kane didn't look up from checking his rifle. It's not. Another whispered. What if we don't make it? He finally raised his gaze, eyes sharp. Then we make sure they don't either. The ship lurched, clamps biting into the fortress hull. The ramp dropped, and the team stormed into fire. The corridors inside stank of rust and blood. Slaver guards poured forward, shouting war cries, but the Marines cut them down in disciplined bursts. Grenades thumped, smoke filled the air, and Kane moved at the front, cold and steady. Some mercenaries didn't even fight. They dropped their weapons the moment they saw the black armored figures advancing. One sobbed. Not the humans, not the Gravekeeper. Cain shot him anyway. Fear was a weapon, but it was not a shield. Room by room, they cleared their way toward the central spire. Cain gave no speeches, no encouragement. Only orders. Left hall. Breach. Hold corridor. His tone was as steady as a metronome, never raised, never uncertain. Halfway in, they breached a chamber lined with cages. Alien children stared out with hollow eyes. Some reached toward the Marines, terrified but desperate. A sergeant glanced at Cain. Orders? Cain's face tightened. Evacuate them. No exceptions. Sir, we can't. He cut him off. We don't leave children in chains. Ever. The sergeant nodded and diverted half the team to escort the prisoners out. Cain pressed on with the rest. The final blast doors groaned as charges ripped them apart. Smoke and fire rolled through the chamber, and Cain stepped inside. Veilthar the Chain Lord waited on a throne of welded bones and chains, towering, his scaled body armored in ceremonial iron. Around him, guards formed a ring, blades drawn. So, Veilthar rumbled, his voice deep enough to shake the walls. The humans send their hound. Tell me, do you know how many worlds I have broken? How many thousands of children I've taken? Cain raised his rifle, the red scope light glowing like an ember. One too many. The guards charged. The Marines met them with fire and steel, the chamber erupting into chaos. Blades clanged against armor, rifles roared, screams echoed. Cain cut his way forward, methodical, every strike driving him closer to the throne. When the last guard fell, Veilthar rose, towering over him, chains dragging across the floor. His jagged teeth bared in a grin. You are nothing but flesh, human. You bleed like the rest. Cain tossed aside his rifle, drawing his combat blade. His voice was ice. Try me. The fight was brutal. Veilthar swung a massive chain, shattering stone pillars. Cain ducked low, driving his blade into the Overlord's thigh, rolling aside before claws tore through the air. They circled, predator against predator. You think killing me will stop the Dominion? Veilthar roared, swinging again. We are endless. Cain dodged, slammed his fist against the alien's jaw, and spat back. So was Rome. The Overlord staggered, but his strength was monstrous. He seized Cain by the chest plate, lifting him like a doll. Cain's armor groaned as claws pierced steel. For a moment, death hung over him. Then Cain's hand shot upward, seizing the chain that coiled around the throne. With a surge of strength, he looped it around Veilthar's throat and yanked. The Overlord roared, thrashing, but Cain dug in, pulling tighter, face grim and unrelenting. This is for New Salem, Cain growled. The chain snapped bones. Veilthar collapsed, choking, clawing at the metal, crushing his neck until the last breath rattled free. His body hit the floor with a thunder that silenced the chamber. Cain stood over him, chest heaving. The Gravekeeper had claimed another. The fortress shuddered as explosions rippled through its hull. Marines rushed in, shouting over comms. Charges are set. We need to move, sir. Cain gave the throne one last look, then turned away. Evacuate. Now. They sprinted back through fire and collapsing steel, dragging freed prisoners in their wake. Dropships clamped, engines roared, and they tore away just as the chain-hold split apart. From orbit, the fortress looked like a dying star, imploding in fire before vanishing into the void. The fleet cheered, but Cain said nothing. He sat in silence as the stars wheeled past the viewport, eyes distant. Days later, he returned to New Salem. The colony was rebuilding slowly, prefabs rising where ash had once settled. At the burial ground, the rows of children's graves remained untouched, fresh soil marked by simple stones. Cain stood alone, helmet cradled in his arm, wind rustling the flags overhead. He knelt before the graves, pressing one gloved hand into the dirt. They're gone, he whispered. You're avenged. He remained there for a long time, until the sun dipped behind the horizon. Across the galaxy, News spread like wildfire. The Chain Lord was dead, his fortress destroyed, his empire fractured. And always, whispered in the retelling, was the same warning: never harm human children. Because if you do, America will send the Gravekeeper.